Hey, welcome to the Sequential Artists Workshop Pro Calls. Every week we ask another creator, another graphic novelist to come sit down with us and tell us where they came from, what were the first things they made, what did they make recently, how did they do it, what are they thinking about now, how are they going to move forward, how do they keep going, all those things, career things, art things, feeling things, creative things. Every month it's a new creator, new challenges, new stories. Come check it out. Come sit down with us. You can sit down live for some of these calls by being a member of our groups. You can find us at learn.sawcomics.org. Come check it out. Come be a graphic novelist with us. Come join us on the socials. Sometimes it's Comics Workshop, sometimes it's Saw Comics. Either way, come check us out and welcome.
Hello, I'm Kay Woodman-Maynard. I go by Kay or Catherine. I'm a mentor here at SAW in the 6-month program. I see a lot of my Krakens here, which is my group name, which I still can't say without kind of laughing. But just a little bit about me before I jump into my presentation. I've been making comics for over a decade, and I do watercolor graphic novels, and I tend to explore themes of acceptance and self-expression, whether in nature or magical realms or social settings, like in my adaptation of The Great Gatsby, which came out from Candlewick Press in 2021. My books tend to blend fantastical elements, like in metaphor or dreams, with more realistic elements, and they often are about uncovering secrets while celebrating personal growth, which is something I'm a big fan of, honesty and personal growth. And I studied animation in undergrad, but I never studied comics, at a school or anything like that. I've done a couple of workshops, but that's kind of it. I've just been doing it a lot. And so I'm going to be talking about my journey. And I just a month ago handed in another book, which is another adaptation that's going to be coming out in 2025. From Farrar, Straus and Giroux, which is an imprint of Macmillan. But unfortunately, it's still unannounced, which means I can't tell you what it is. So that's frustrating. But I'm going to show you some art from it. And actually, you'll probably be some of the first people to really see it outside of a handful. I don't know if I'm supposed to be sharing it, but it's okay. So I'm going to jump right in to my presentation. Okay. So that's me, and that's my name. I'm going to be talking about kind of my comics journey, I guess. Various book pitches. When I was laying out this presentation yesterday, I was just like, oh my goodness, I have done so many pitches. My process making Gatsby, and it's not really that different from my process making my other adaptation, and another process that I use for working on a graphic memoir, and then finally kind of Substack and diary comics, which have been giving me a lot of joy lately, and then questions. And this is probably going to be like way too much stuff in a presentation. So, if you hear something that I just kind of skim over, feel free to jot it down, and hopefully we'll have a long question time. And I'm also in the SAW network, so you can message me there too. So I really didn't grow up reading comics at all. I guess that's not entirely true. I read them in the Sunday papers, but I didn't read graphic novels. I didn't really read comic books. I didn't feel like they were geared at me. They felt very masculine and kind of anti-feminist. And even from a young age, I was like a little feminist. I didn't like all those breasts and bulging muscles in the superhero comics. And so, but when I was a senior in college, I did a class. It was like a pass-fail class that I just kind of chose because it sounded vaguely interesting, and it was called Vision and the Brain, and it was about how the brain and kind of how you see things. And one of the books in it that was assigned was Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. And it kind of blew my mind. I was like, oh my gosh, this is really how my brain works. And I hadn't really identified it in that way of like images plus text. And so that sort of was the kindling for my interest in comics. And so I graduated from college and I started making comics. This is one of my first ones. I did it digitally because I felt like that's what you should learn. And I did it in Photoshop, and I hated Photoshop at first. It just killed me. I cried the first time I used it, but I was like, I'm going to learn it. And this is one of my early attempts at comics. And I'm just sharing this because I think it's useful to see kind of where somebody was and where they get. So I graduated college and I ended up getting this random job making a web series called Post Nup. And it was animated, and it was just short animations that came out once every 6 weeks. And this other man, Sandeep Sood, was the writer, and he kind of bankrolled it. And I did the animation and kind of everything else. And we both did the voice acting. And as part of this, it takes so long to make an animation that we decided to put out comics as well, just sort of to keep our viewers interested. And so that was my first experience kind of making comics consistently. And I realized that I enjoyed it more than animation. I liked that it was a lot faster to tell the story. I liked that it didn't have so many moving parts. And I've just always loved drawing. So I've always been into that. And so I decided I was going to start working on a graphic novel. And I worked on it for several years. These are sketches from it as I was kind of trying to figure out the story. It was an epic fantasy adventure story. And I started sort of laying it out in a really rough way on my iPad. I always struggle with going too detailed too fast. So I worked this way so that I just figure out the story before getting too into it. But it was very ugly. And I was just kind of struggling along. I wasn't really getting help. Wasn't really, like, I was reading some books on it, but I didn't really reach out to the comics community. I think I was honestly like too insecure to do so, but I was committed to it. And I eventually like left San Francisco where I was doing animation, and my husband and I moved to Maine where it was a lot cheaper to live. And so that I could devote more time to graphic novels. And so I sort of ended up leaving animation and making most of my living on graphic design for like basically the last 10 years until I stopped doing graphic design this year. So I'd spend half my days doing graphic novels in the morning and then half my days doing graphic design, which is really how I earned my living. So I really kind of made a commitment at this point that this was my calling and I needed to do it. And so I did a class at the Center for Cartoon Studies with Paul Karasik called, I think it's called The Graphic Novel. Something like that. And that was wonderful. And then I really started learning how to make a graphic novel. And this is from my first pitch for Ironbound, which I worked on for maybe 3-4 years before it was ready to pitch. And then I queried for an agent. And I got some requests to read it, but those people ultimately passed. And I sent it to other agents further down the list. And I got somebody who wanted to represent me. And I had feelings of concern about him. Like I wasn't sure that he'd read my book just based on some of the things that he said. He just, there was something just a little off about him, but I talked to people and I couldn't find anything online about him. And I decided to go with him. And I'll talk more about that decision later, but he sent it out on submission because part of it was I didn't have any other offers and I'd been working on this for so many years that I was like, I'm gonna try to at least get this sold. And so here's some links about graphic novel agents. Jane Friedman is an excellent resource. This is an article I actually wrote for her about landing a graphic novel agent. And then this is another resource who has a list of graphic novel agents. So we can post that afterwards too, or if you can kind of just copy it down. But so he sent that on submission. Meanwhile, I turned to a second book in the same kind of world, but standalone, called Shadebreaker. And while I was working on Shadebreaker, stuff came out about him that he was a shady agent and he got kicked out of the agent organization, even though he was part of a really big agency that he's still at, as far as I know. I'm not saying his name because he has filed legal suit against people who do, so or talk about him. But I requested to see what he had sent out, and he introduced typos into my pitches. They were just really sloppy pitches, which I spent so many years on, so it was awful. So I fired him, and I then was working on Gatsby, and I found a new agent where I pitched Gatsby. And so after working on 2 of my own books that hadn't sold, and I wasn't sure if they hadn't sold because of the stories or because of the agent or both, I wanted to do something that was in a different area. And actually the first agent suggested that maybe I think about an adaptation, and I'd always loved The Great Gatsby. And so I kind of looked up, is it in the public domain? It was coming in the public domain in a couple of years, which means I could legally do it. And I, created a pitch for it. And these are the opening pages of Gatsby. And you can see I've really changed my style here, because obviously the woodcut style I was working in before was not at all suitable for the Great Gatsby. And I think I just spent time figuring out what was the right look, what was the mood I wanted to create. I'm always kind of thinking about mood. And somebody suggested that I do watercolor, which I had never done before, but I experimented with and thought that really captures what I want in this story. And so I went ahead and did it. And so these are just the opening pages, and you can see some kind of elements that you see again and again in my work, like kind of working narration into the landscape. So like into the clouds, you can see this has narration, a little more abstract page panels. I had a lot of fun with speech bubbles, that kind of thing. So I ended up selling Gatsby to Candlewick Press, and it came out in 2021. And I'm going to be talking a lot more about my process creating it, but I just wanted you all to see kind of the style here. And I worked on that for, I think, maybe a year and a half, and then it came out. And after I handed in Gatsby, I started working on a graphic memoir, kind of about my experience growing up in a family with a father with bipolar disorder and family secrecy. And my first version, I used all these animals. So I was a polar bear, my sister and mom were birds, my dad was a bear to sort of signify our bonding. And I worked on this full pitch, and we pitched it to Candlewick, and they had some feedback that was legitimate about like why it didn't work. So I went back to the drawing board, after talking to my agent, and I did another version, which my agent didn't think would work. And so I did another version, and these are all like full pitches that I created. At this point, I didn't do a full pitch of this one. I was like, hey, agent, tell me this stuff sooner. And this was adult. So I went from like middle grade to then trying adult. And then I worked on a fourth version where I ended up hiring Rob Clow, who's a SAW instructor too, to help me sort of craft the story, because I find it's really hard with memoir to kind of separate yourself and look at it. And so I created this version, which is called Unvoiced, and it is currently out on submission. But even after my agent had been involved in all of this, she told me that she didn't think she could sell it. And she knew how important the story was to me. And she said, I'm fine if you want to switch agents. And so I ended up switching agents, which was really hard at the time, but I also did feel like it wasn't the right fit. Even though she was a great agent, I didn't feel like she understood what I was trying to tell. And so I switched agents again. So I'm on agent number 3, whose name is Sarah Crow. And she was representing a friend of mine who I was working on a historical romance with, my friend Nicole Kronzer. And so that's out on submission, and so is Unvoiced. But it's been out on submission for a long time, so I don't even know if it will sell at this point. I'm skeptical. So that's something I kind of wanted to share with you all, because as I've been mentoring in SAW, I kind of like, I hope that your books will all sell, that you want to have published, and that will sell quickly. But, my experience is it was really like 7 years before I got anything published. And even once I'm published, it's still really hard. And it's just a long time. And I find that to be the case for a lot of writers I talk to, that it's often maybe 7 to 10 years before you get published. And, hopefully that won't be the case for you, but also be prepared for that. And I think you have to find other parts of the process. You have to love it for itself. You have to be getting other things from it than publishing deals, I think, in order to sustain something for this long. So out of the blue, my second agent reached out to me because there was an adaptation project that came to her, and it was for a different one of her clients, and he didn't have time, but she thought I'd be perfect for it. So she passed it my way. And so my new agent represented it, but it was the project I'm working on, which is a pretty big project. It's for an anniversary edition of a book that's not in the public domain. And so that's what I've been working on for the last year and a half. And so that's like, after all these like tumultuous times of publishing. This was like the first real piece of luck. It felt like that had happened, and it was really amazing luck. And the project has been just wonderful to work on. And I don't have text written in here because of the project, but you can kind of get a sense of the story. So I guess I'm going to pause there before I go into the process. But any questions? Since I went through that kind of my publishing journey very quickly.
Okay, there's a couple that have popped up. Let's see. Liza Fontana wanted to know, is Gatsby digital watercolor or hand drawn? And she says, beautiful work.
Thank you. I will go into that. It is digitally drawn, but watercolored by hand. So that's what I'm going to be showing shortly.
I had a question too. Would you ever consider self-publishing or, trying to pitch to a smaller publisher?
Yeah, so I've thought a lot about that for my memoir, because I have had interest from a smaller publisher, but right now I've spent like 2,000 hours or more on that memoir. And I feel like to do it with so little money, because smaller publishers, you get very little as an advance right now, doesn't feel right to me. That might change. I am considering publishing segments, like trying to get those published maybe in like a, online journal or something like that. Cause I think they could be standalone, some of the chapters. Cause I colored a huge amount. I colored like 70 pages, I think, of the memoir, which is way more than most. I did 20 pages for Gatsby colored. And even that's on the high end for a pitch. So I did like 70, and then maybe, it's like a third almost done. So it is a good question, but it's really a financial thing. And also the emotional, I didn't even talk about the most important part, was the emotional toll of doing a memoir, because I did it without telling my family about it. And then when I told them about it, the first version with the bears and the birds, they really freaked out. And I was essentially like removed from the family, like uninvited from gatherings, like really extreme behavior, not spoken to, because I was breaking the secrecy of the family. And now I would have gone about it in a different way, but it was really traumatic. And that's, I think, also why maybe I changed the version so much as I was grappling with that. And I ended up in the final version working their reaction in, because it was sort of like the theme of the story is secrecy and how detrimental that was to who I was. And then to have that have that happen, felt so like part of the story. But in retrospect, I'm like, wow, I did that way too soon to when it happened. And all these things, but it was like a life-changing event. But on the upside, after several years, and maybe we did family therapy and are in a much better place, and I think have better relationships than previous to it. I wish I had not had to go through that pain, and they had not had to go through that pain in order to get where we are. But I am going on a trip where I'm going to be with them next week, which is like remarkable in the sense of what happened with the story. But I know a lot of you are working on memoir, and I think my family's reaction was extreme in my view. But it's hard if you have a family dynamic that's been a certain way and you want to talk about it. But I have, now I wish I had done shorter comics so that they got used to me, like talking about my life, and like, kind of built them up to it or ease them into it. There are a lot of different things, but it was horrible. And now I'm in a better place, but that's like so I really should have said that before. And then my agent didn't even want to pitch it. So like, but that's okay. It's like her prerogative. She's like, she's correct. It has not sold. So there's that too.
There's a couple of other questions that have been popping up, and I'm not sure how many you want to take before you move on to the next section.
If they're kind of related to this.
Yeah, there's a couple about agents and pitching.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So let's see. Chris Seidel says, what is an example of shadiness in an agent? Is there a way to figure it out in real time?
Yeah, so now there is a website called Writers Beware, which they list these things. And my agent was not on that. Like I looked at, before I signed up with him, I did like really deep research, and but he is now. And so for him, it was sloppiness. Like he would pitch graphic novels to people who didn't represent graphic novels. He would just, pitch to whomever. Like it was just more like he'd throw out darts and hope that they land. Whereas like a good agent has a relationship with the publisher and knows, oh, they really love this type of book. I'm going to pitch it to them. And, like it's all about the relationship. So, but I mean, other kinds of shadiness are like people who accept, they should take 15% of whatever you make. That's how the agent thing is set up. But there are agents who you pay to represent you, which is shady. That would be an example of a shady agent, or of course, just shady behavior in general. Like Me Too type stuff, which my agent was not being accused of, to be clear. So,
awesome. Another question is, how much material do you need to have prepared for a pitch? I know you did 70 pages and you did 20 pages, and what do you think?
So I did so many for the memoir because my agent felt like it was an unusual premise. I was like using fairy tales to explain things in my life, and she felt like I needed to kind of have a substantial amount so that the publishers could understand it. But Gatsby is, like they kind of know from a business standpoint, this is what this is going to be. Like it's in a popular book. So I like to do the first chapter. I always do the first bit so that they can get the sense of my storytelling ability. Some people choose like random pages throughout the book. I don't like to do that. Maybe if there's a scene later, I'll include some images in my synopsis. But okay, so you need final art. I'd like to do about a chapter. And then you need a synopsis, which can be 1 to 3 pages. Some people do scripts, some people do not. And you need a query letter. All of this is in that article that I wrote. So I think that's probably the best thing to check out.
Awesome. So that people can refer to that if they want more information about that. Okay, great. Let me see if there is. Oh yeah, what kind of feedback? Sally is asking, what kind of feedback did you get around making the graphic memoir more publishable? I know you said you worked with Rob Plow.
Oh yeah. Well, it was just more to like focus it with Rob, kind of coming up with a structure, some sort of external thing like the fairy tales, which were kind of coming up in the story anyway, but bringing those further forward. But one thing I struggle with, that I think is a struggle in a lot of my books as to why they're not selling is age range too. So like my memoir is sort of in between YA and adult is harder to sell than YA, but even YA is pretty hard to sell. So now like my current book I'm working in is middle grade because I'm just like, this is hard. And I don't know if I'll sell middle grade, but my adaptation is middle grade. So I figured that could help. So yeah. Should I jump into process stuff?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
Let's see. Yeah, let's move on. Okay.
Okay.
And if there are extra questions, we can keep at it at the end.
Great. Okay. So just want to say, this is just my process. There isn't a right way to make a graphic novel. I feel like when I give these talks, people are like, oh, this is how it's done. And it's like, no, this is just how I do it with my unique skills and ways of working. Every cartoonist is different. I think if there are things that I say that sound good, then, maybe think about doing those. But if the way I talk about my work sounds awful, it's probably not the right process for you. But I really firmly believe that part of the journey is figuring out what works for you in terms of efficiency, enjoyment, and your end goal. So I always am thinking about that as I'm figuring out how to work and tweaking my process. So this is my general process, just moving from very sketchy to more and more refined. So I go from outlining to thumbnail drawing, rough sketches and script, character design, pencils, inking, coloring, and post-production. So I'm going to go through all of those steps, but that's kind of the general thing. And I start very, very sketchy because I've learned that that's when I figure out the story. That's when I figure out where there might be issues. And I want to do that before I've really committed the time and energy to making beautiful art. When I started making graphic novels, I would make these beautiful pages, but then, the character would end up getting cut because they weren't necessary to the story, things like that. So I really spend a lot of time in these early stages making sure that things are working. This is my kind of old work setup when I lived in New Hampshire, and I use a lot of different tools when I'm working. I'm really going back and forth between traditional and digital work, and that is based on what I enjoy, because I kind of prioritize what I enjoy because I think I do it better. And I also, yeah, I prioritize my own enjoyment of it. So, but I also want speed. So that's why I kind of move back and forth. So I use pencil and paper, I watercolor, I use a drawing tablet that's like a Cintiq. I scan in my art. Sometimes I use a light box. The main programs I use are Clip Studio Paint, Photoshop, InDesign, and I use a Mac. But this is kind of what it generally looks like. But you do not need all this stuff. You all know that. So many of you just work with an iPad and Procreate, but I just want to say this is kind of how I work based on kind of my skills. So I start by outlining. This can happen in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's like mind maps. Sometimes it's note cards like I have in the upper right, although I don't tend to do too many note cards for like the whole story. It's more like I'm figuring out a specific sequence. This is like a mind map in the lower right. Do a lot of notes, things like that, where I'm just trying to get my mind around the story. This is more true for my own original works as opposed to adaptations, because with adaptations, I tend to be able to just, you know, I have the outline already there in the original book. I just have to take out the parts I want to show. I spend a ton of time doing thumbnails. So these are an example of my thumbnails. I'm going to hold some up too, so you can see they're like on an 11 by 17 sheet of paper. I like to see the whole chapter at once. And so this is chapter 1 of Gatsby. And I have 2 pages side by side. That's a page spread. I'm always working in page spreads because I'm working for a print medium, and I always want to think about what's coming after the page turn. You always want to put dramatic information after the page turn, because if you put it on the right-hand page, people often skip over whatever's on the left, and it just keeps people moving. So I write down the major action underneath each page. So like Tom gets a call and Daisy leaves, and then subheader, you know, sub actions. And I do this to make sure I'm not putting too much on the page. When I first started making graphic novels, I try to cram the page with information, and there's not really that much space on a graphic novel page. So you have to figure out what you can include. So this is kind of the page at the beginning. Just, I'm doing this in Illustrator, but you could just draw it out on a piece of paper. I like to do it in Illustrator or just another computer program because I tend to move my stuff around a lot. So I'll lay out all the text like I have here. The things in red are scenes I'm not so sure about, pages I'm not so sure about. And then I will, once I kind of have played around with that a lot, I'll draw it in. And then once I start drawing, I'm realizing like, oh, I need more pages here. So I'm just drawing them in. I'm saying this should go over, you know, it's a very fluid part of the process. This is actually one of my favorite parts of the process because it's really like figuring out the puzzle of the story. And yes, this is just a close-up to show how I'm moving it all around. And then this is all of the thumbnails laid out for a whole book. So you can kind of, it's the blueprint of the story. And then once I kind of have that blueprint, I shift to doing the script. For Gatsby, this is a much more detailed script than I do anymore. I'm like saying panel by panel what's happening and then the dialogue. But now I do much more basic scripts. So I'm not saying what panel or like that it's a wide shot or a close shot most of the time. I'm just saying the action and the dialogue. And that's because this type of script is more common if you are working with another artist, but since I'm the writer and the artist, I know that I'm going to change things. And so this is really for a publisher to read the story and for me to keep in mind what's happening on each page. So for my scripts, I always have 1 page of the script equals 1 page of the graphic novel. And then I'm keeping track about which is the left and which is the right-hand page. So you can see like here, 129 is on the right-hand side. That means it's a right-hand page so that I know that that's going to be a page turn. And I just have it go back and forth in my script so that I keep that in mind, which is really important to me because it's all about pacing. And so much of graphic novel making is about pacing. So I'm thinking about when that page turn is happening. Once I have that done, like if you're working with a publisher, you know, I had to send my publisher the script and we went back and forth on that. But once the script is approved, I then turn to sketches. And I should mention that you don't always have to do a script. For my memoir, I didn't do a script because that wasn't sort of the type of story that needed one. And I'd drawn so much of it already. but it kind of depends how different creators work. So next I moved on to rough sketches, and I just take an 11 by 17 sheet of paper. I just fold it in half, and that's approximately the size of a page. And then I draw it in with blue pencil. And these are like 5-minute sketches, super fast. It's just to kind of get out what my initial thought is of the page. And so this is that page. I tried cutting it out. One chapter, I was like, this feels like an unnecessary step. And I tried cutting it out. And then I realized it actually saved me a lot of time and helped me work through things. So I tend to work really iteratively. And so this is just part of the many iterations where at every stage I'm thinking, like, how can I make this better? So I feel like it's one of those steps that saves me time, takes time in the moment, but saves me time in the long run, which is something I've been talking to the Krakens about. So I'm going to show you this page later and kind of go through all the process, but somewhere in here, I start doing character design, and I make a character sheet for each major character, which is something that I think is very common in animation, but I kind of do a turnaround of the character and the character's face in a lot of different poses and some different emotions. I'll often draw the character again and again with different emotions that they're feeling, so that I get to know the character, because not everyone shows anger in the same way. Some people, lean forward, some people lean back, some people furrow their brow, some people, become bigger, all these things that you want to figure out about your character. And then I often have, while I'm working, the character sheet right next to me so that I stay consistent. I struggle with consistency, and like kind of the age of my character, I feel like changes a little bit over the course of the story and things. So I kind of keep it next to me. Some characters, this is Daisy in The Great Gatsby. She just kind of came out fully formed. I didn't have to do a lot of work on her. So her character sheet is much shorter. But this was Nick Carraway, the protagonist, and my publishers didn't think how I was drawing him initially was good, and they were, I think, correct. Like, it was too abstract, so they really pushed me on finishing this one, changing this one up. Then I move on to pencils. So I'm taking that rough page that I did in blue, and then this is when I start working digitally. I use Clip Studio Paint, and I'm just sketching it out. And this is also a stage I really love. I'm still pretty rough. Some artists' pencils are really a lot more beautiful than this. But currently these are my pencils. They're a little cleaner than this is, like, from my current book, to get a sense. And I'm just doing it in red because I'm trying to remind myself that this art does not need to be beautiful. I'm figuring out the story. I'm laying everything out. I'm figuring out the emotions of the character, but I don't want to be wasting time making it beautiful. And by drawing it in red, that helps remind me of it. It's also a traditional kind of penciling color in comics. Blue and red are. And as I'm drawing this out, I use myself as reference a lot. I find that that's faster than Google Images. And now Google Images, I'm finding a lot less useful as AI has encroached on it, because I actually want real photos of things, not concept art. And so I take a lot of photos of myself. So these are just examples. I just do it on my computer screen. And I don't do it for every character and every pose, but it's just really where I feel like I'm struggling. I will do that. I also use models of things. So cars are super important in The Great Gatsby. So I had a little car model that I borrowed from a friend, or I went to a car museum to get a sense of the scale. I also do like environment kind of mapping, sort of similar to the character designs, but for the environment. So this is Gatsby's house, which is very important in the story, and I'm drawing it from each view, and I'm also making sure I'm consistent, because my publisher Candlewick had consistency readers, so they noticed, like, oh, the lamp changed shape from this page to the next page, and I didn't want to create a ton of work for them on that, and so this is kind of what I use to help with that. So back to this, so it's pencils. And then I go to inks. I digitally ink in my books, so this is still in Clip Studio Paint, so you can kind of see pencils, inks. It's essentially tracing over them, but I often make changes when I ink. I'm still doing a fair amount of refining. And then this is the color, where the real magic happens, I feel. And like I said, I learned watercolor for this story. I'm still pretty basic in my watercolor usage, but this was the first watercoloring I did to test out whether I thought it would work for the story. And when I did this, I was like, oh yeah, this captures the mood, the kind of lushness of the Great Gatsby, the booziness. And so I just explored and learned a lot from YouTube. I hired a watercolor professor for like an hour and just kind of jumped in, but I gave myself a very limited color palette, which helped me kind of move through the story fast and limit my decision making. So what I do is I print out my inked pages, which are digitally inked, onto watercolor paper. And I have a G-Clay, like fine art printer that allows that. And I tested this. So I printed it out and then I watercolor over it. And then I scan in the art. And so I like to do this because I like digitally inking and penciling because I work so iteratively. It allows me to try things again and again. But I hate digital coloring. And so that's also why I do it this way, because I like doing this by hand. And I think that that by hand feeling really connects to people and gives the story an emotional resonance that I wouldn't be able to do with regular digital coloring. So I test out all my coloring too. So I print out all my little, this is like a page, my little thumbnails. These are inks that I just print out in a tiny size onto watercolor paper, and then I test out different color palettes. And then this was the color palette I used for Gatsby on the bottom left. So I just gave myself these 8 colors, and usually I'd use 2 or 3 in a scene. And I had a serious deadline for Gatsby because of the public domain. And so I really had to like go cracking through that book. And the limited color palette really helped. But now I love doing watercolor. Like it's so fun. And I love that even when I make like mistakes, it still, I think, looks really good. So then I scan in the art that I have watercolored and I clean it up. So this was before, this is cleaned up. Not a huge change in this one really. I add in the bright white, I add in the text and InDesign, page numbers, things like that. Sometimes I make changes to the color, but I try to be limited, cleaning up dust. Here's another page, which is a little more extreme of an example. So you can see the change. So I am adding in a border, I'm adding in stars, I'm adding in the hand lettering that I do in Photoshop, and then the other text is a font that I made of my handwriting. So just to go back, because I know this is a ton, this is like thumbnails to roughs, to pencils, to inking, to coloring. So those are kind of my stages. So this is a different page. So this is pencils to inks. And you can see I've made a lot more changes from here because I didn't think the pencils were working. And I changed up it so that it would be more dramatic and more tension. And so from there to there to there. And then kind of how I stay motivated is I kind of check off a page every day. Every time I finish a page, I check off a square on this chart. So this is chapter 1, row 1 is penciling, inking, coloring. So every time I finish it, I check it off. And that just helps me keep my momentum going, have some sense of accomplishment because it's such a huge project and you're often pretty alone in it. And so this really helps me keep going. But I was also a kid who loved stickers in school, and this is just like another way to do stickers for myself. And then I also have a letterpress tray on my wall right over here that I put a rock in every time I finish a chapter. So when I finish a chapter of penciling, I put a rock in, you know, etc. So that really helps me keep going. And I kind of encourage you to think about ways that you can chart your progress that keeps you motivated, because it's really like helped me a lot. That's me as on the last day of Gatsby with a huge stack of final arts. You can really see the quantity of the art, especially on watercolor paper. It looks pretty huge. And then that's how I felt. But luckily, when I finished my current book, it was not as exhausting because it was a better timeline. But, you know, this is my process kind of for this book. But when I was working on my memoir, I did a different process of writing the story where basically I would have an overall idea. So that's kind of Gatsby, more like each stage. This is more writing, working from the inside out, which is what I did on my memoir, where I kind of know what is going to happen in the chapter. I have the framework, and then I take a single image, you know, from an important scene, and then I pencil the segment around it, and I place it in the timeline. So very different than kind of when I have an adaptation and I know this is going to happen and then this is going to happen. When you're writing your own story, you have to figure it out. And this was the way that I did it with the memoir. So this is sort of the overall structure where I have an introduction, a chapter on each family member, and then the ending. And this is like the overall bird's eye view timeline. And then I sketch important images for the book. And I just did a ton of these images. They're really rough. They're just kind of for me, but there were interesting ideas that came out of them. And I'm thinking visually. And a lot of them didn't make it into the book, but some of them did. And then I penciled out sequences around those images and placed them in like a much bigger timeline. So kind of, this is like a chapter. This is the first chapter. This is each family member, and that's the end chapter. And I kind of have my general idea of my page count, and I'm just placing it in and writing in what I think would happen. So I'm sharing that because in case that's useful for you. I know a lot of you are working on memoirs, but it was a helpful way for me to think about it for this story. And then my number one tip for aspiring graphic novelists is just to make daily diary comics, or just daily comics in general. I've been doing this for the last couple of years, and I found like so much enjoyment, so much emotional processing, figuring out my style, figuring out what works, kind of storytelling. So I'm just a huge believer in diary comics, and it took me a long time before I started doing them. And so I want to share that with you all. And I do them very fast. Like these are probably 10-minute comics that I then watercolor very quickly later. And I've been having a lot of fun sharing them in Substack. Recently, I have a newsletter that goes out weekly called Creating Comics, where I want artists to create more and feel less bad about themselves in the process. And I share tools, structure, and mindset I use to overcome creative obstacles. So I often share a diary comic and then kind of do a post about that subject. So I wanted to share that with you all because you can subscribe. And also I'm going to soon be doing workshops and different kinds of group and probably graphic novel consulting too. So that is my very jam-packed presentation. So now I'm very happy to answer whatever questions people have for that.
Thanks so much, Kay. That was great. So much information. I subscribe to your Substack, and I really enjoy it. And I'm gonna keep reading. I want you to do a breakdown of like how you actually do a diary comic in 10 minutes, because I've done a lot of diary comics, but they never go that quick.
Yeah, maybe I'm lying. You know, like I don't time it, you know, like I think it's like I'm brushing my teeth. I do them at night and then I'm thinking about it. You know what I mean? Like, and then I like going about my night. Like, yeah, I'll have to think how long it actually is. Maybe it's more like 20, but they're not very thought out.
So that's very quick. So
Yeah.
Tell us your secrets. There's a lot of questions that came up about sort of technical stuff, and I wonder if we should address those just kind of right away. Is that all right?
Yeah.
So there's a question about, why you choose the programs that you do. I think from Beth, she wanted to know, you work in Clip Studio Paint, but why that? Why not Photoshop? Why not something else? Like, how do you choose?
Yeah.
Because you can kind of get lost in the world of software for sure.
Totally. I like Clip Studio Paint because you can see all your pages together. Like I do. So it's like a Clip Studio Paint file where I can see thumbnails of each page. And then I can easily switch between page to page. Whereas in Photoshop or Procreate, I think you have a file for each page and you can't really see the flow. And I'm, again, always thinking about pacing. And so I really like to be able to quickly go through the pages and read them. So that's the main reason I use Clip Studio Paint. It does have nice features like with panel borders to create panel borders quickly, or speech bubbles. I hand draw my speech bubbles, which I'm always cursing later, but it does help if you're just doing a quick one, or if that works in your style. And I just like the pencil that I have in it, but it's really the ability to switch between pages is why I use Clip Studio Paint. And then Photoshop I use for cleaning up the art. And I worked as a graphic designer for years, so I just knew that program very well, but I assume Procreate could do the same things. I'm not doing super advanced Photoshop things, but it's just what I'm comfortable with. And then InDesign is kind of the industry standard for laying out your book. So that's where I do that. But publishers can also do that too. I did it for my publisher and handed it over to them because I like to be very particular about where my text goes in the bubbles. I don't want somebody else putting that in. So that's kind of why I choose those programs.
Awesome. There are a lot of very specific questions about like what paper you use, what printer you use, what scanner you use for watercolor, and maybe you could just, I don't know.
It's all on my website.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so it's all on my website. There's like posts, I'm not sure exactly where, but like posts about my process. And I just name this is the printer and this is the scanner. But I did get a new printer lately, and that's not up to you. So
Well, excellent. I mean, but people can go and find that information on your website.
Yes.
That's really
Yeah.
good. Okay. Yeah, let me see. Yeah, well, the question about the timeline. Do you have a certain program that you're using to make that timeline when you were showing the memoir?
I was just using Illustrator to do that.
So you
But
just make like a big long file and then drop in the
yeah,
page.
I'm just making a board and then another board for other chapter and then another board for another chapter. But recently I've started using the Save the Cat software because my current story is very standard kind of Hollywood type pacing. And there's a book called Save the Cat, which is a story structure book about how to plot out stories. And they have a web app that you can use for it, and it's been helpful for me in terms of how I work. So I'm using that currently for my book. And that's been working well too. But essentially it's similar where it just allows you to move things around a timeline easily.
Excellent. Let's see. Okay. So kind of moving away a little bit from the technical questions and maybe just like how you make it all work. Mary was asking, how did you balance graphic novel work and financial work over all this time and workload and having a personal life and self-care?
Yeah. I mean, that's always the question. I mean, one of the things was moving to a cheap place, right? Like keeping your expenses lower helps a whole lot. So like I left San Francisco, moved to New England where it was a lot less expensive. Now I'm in Minneapolis. It's also less expensive here. And so I was able to make, my clients, I never respond. I just never responded to my clients in the morning. I'd read my emails first thing and respond to anything. Then for the next like 3-4 hours, I would just do graphic novels, and then I'd have lunch and go for a run. And then I'd do graphic design in the afternoon. And at different points, the percentages were different, like sometimes it'd only be 2 hours of graphic novels and more graphic design. But basically I identified like my most productive time of day is the morning. And the most important thing to me is graphic novels. So I'm going to do that first thing. And I'm not going to check my email during that time because clients are going to email and I don't want to have my headspace. So I really try to be focused when I'm working, and I have my phone off, like I'm not responding. And they just kind of get used to it too, because I was freelancing. So it's not like they have control over my time anyway. And then I did the work in the afternoon, and I was able to make that work. But at the end of this year, I decided to stop doing graphic design, and because it just wasn't fulfilling to me. And I felt like I have a lot to share about graphic novels, and I wanted to make my living more based on, my passion. And so now I've hired a business coach, and I'm trying to figure out like how to create this into a career. And I'm living on my savings like currently, essentially. But for the last 10 years, I was just living on the graphic design stuff. And then occasionally, you get an advance, and that's wonderful, but it wasn't enough to sustain me. And my last adaptation kind of was enough, but you also don't get it all at once. Like I got, a quarter of it on signing, a quarter of it on handing in my script, quarter of it on handing in the book, and then I get a quarter of it in a year from now. So like you're not getting it soon. And I don't have another book lined up. So that's also why I'm trying to figure it out. But basically, to answer the question, it's like I'm figuring out ways in my life that I can save money and live frugally. And then I'm just prioritizing graphic novels, and I'm keeping that time sacred. That's really important to me, and not letting things kind of come in. And I mentioned this to my Krakens recently, was that I started out just doing 20 minutes a day on graphic novels. So like every morning before I went to my animation job, I would just do 25 minutes, and nobody was in the office. I'd actually do it in the office. I would do graphic novels for 25 minutes, and then I would have the rest of my day. And then bit by bit, that time got bigger because I committed to it and built the habit. And so I'm a big believer in that, like building up the habits.
And 25 minutes is coincidentally the length of a Pomodoro.
Yes, so I definitely work in a Pomodoro system, which for those of you who don't know, it's like 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off, sets of 4, and then you take a longer break, and then you do that again. And I started that on my own, not knowing it was a method in college, because I had really bad tennis elbow from rowing and also drawing a lot. And so I just started doing that in order to be able to keep drawing, was to take breaks. And I noticed that I was a lot more productive and happier. And so I've just continued working that way. And I have my timer, Helga, who reminds me to take breaks. So I like to work that way, but I know other people might interrupt their creative flow. But one key thing is I try not to check email during that 5-minute break if I'm working on my story, because then you're just going elsewhere, or social media or whatever.
There were a few questions then about talking about the process of memoir. And I don't know, would it be possible for you to go back to that screen where you were kind of talking about the overview of your memoir process?
Yeah.
You could share again.
Yeah.
And then, okay.
This one?
Yeah, I think so, right? Okay, and then while we're looking at that, perhaps I could also ask you, Jen A has asked, do you think it's better to write as if your family is not going to read it when you're writing about them? Having done like what
Having done that.
coming out the other side,
No,
what
but I
do you
didn't do
recommend
that. Is the thing that I was editing myself. Like I didn't just write as though my family wasn't going to read it, but that was still so much more than my family could handle. I don't know. The memoir process was really liberating for me. Like it allowed me to work through so many things on my own and also with my family. But I don't know that I can answer that for you. Like I feel like everyone is so different in terms of who they are and who their family is and how they might handle it. But it's hard.
It was so interesting to hear you say that, like having not really eased your family into being drawn or written about, and then sort of showing up with like the big project, like, here we are, guys.
You're animals.
They're like, what? It just like caught them totally off guard. So that's an interesting thing to think about, because I write a lot about my family and I always have. So it's like nobody would be surprised, right? And like I've been writing small little things about them for years, and so there's sort of an easing in.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I don't know.
And that's kind of what I wish I had done. And, like that it wouldn't be such a surprise, but I wasn't somebody who was sharing diary comics like I do now. And I wasn't ever that focused on myself, like in my work. So I can see why they were surprised and caught off guard. And I've learned that they need more time to process things. So yeah.
I'm glad to hear that you were able to work through all of that, or some of it at least.
Some of it. Yeah, some of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, family therapy is a really powerful thing, and I'm very grateful that they were willing to do it, because it was really hard for all of us. Yeah.
But it sounds like it was really for the best.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think so. They might totally disagree. They might, but yeah.
Awesome.
People can also ask questions. Like, I mean,
if anyone wants to jump in at this point, I'm just reading from the chat, but if anybody, just raise your hand, and then you can probably even just unmute if nobody is speaking.
Sarah, you can go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So a lot of the process that I'm seeing that you do is actually very helpful to me. Like there's some things that I've seen like I totally do by myself, but like seeing you do it, it's like, oh, cool, somebody else does it. It's not just weirdo me doing it. And like there are a couple of things that I'm also like, oh, that's a neat trick. Oh, that's really cool. Um, I guess my question is like, is what do you do when you have to when you step away from something? If you're like facing that kind of self-doubt that people have, what do you do to kind of buck yourself up or like convince yourself to keep going, essentially?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I am faced with a strong inner critic a lot of the time, and certainly have self-doubt. And I think that's why it took me so long before I started taking workshops and stuff, because I was so scared. And I think now I do practice self-compassion a lot, you know, and there's a wonderful book by Kristen Neff called Self-Compassion. Martha's clapping her hand. I'm trying to write that in here. I don't know if I spelled Kristen right, but it's great. And it's a lot about, you know, being like, you know, we're humans make mistakes, we're not perfect, like all of these things, and kind of just being okay with that and keeping going anyway. So that's kind of how I try to view it, is it's like I can feel all of these doubts, but I'm not going to stop creating. And that's kind of why I'm so big on creating a creative habit, is because habits are so strong once they're developed that even if you're feeling self-doubt, if you always create at 8 a.m., it's going to be really hard not to create at 8 a.m. in my experience because of that habit. And so I use habit and structure a lot to fight against self-doubt. Just that it's like, this is what I do. Like, it doesn't matter if I'm feeling this way. I'm working on this right now. And some days are better than others. You know, sometimes I'm creating much better work than others, but I still try to be consistent. So I hope that helps, Sarah.
Catherine, there's a question that I missed earlier that came in from Young, and they write, I've done comic strips before, but I've never attempted a web comic or self-published comic before. If you're new, do agents prefer you to have already finished or attempted a longer form comic before they take on your book proposal?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't done a long form comic before my agent took me on. I mean, I think there were things in my query letter, you know, about my biography that probably made them trust that I could follow through on this. Like, I was already working in the field. I went to a prestigious school, like things that kind of gave feel like some sort of like she can follow through on this. But I hadn't done a long form comic before I got Gatsby. But I also had created these other pitches, which I had elements of on my website. And so like there was and my first book, I drew like 372 pages or something crazy of pencils. So even though I never actually finished that book fully, like it's the full arc is there.
So it just depends on your scenario, right? Like kind of the different elements that you're bringing in, right? So the fact that you know, were able to take on large form projects, even if they weren't graphic novels, right? Like,
yes, right. That they could see, okay, she's able to finish these animations on her own, you know, like she's able to have a career, you know, like these different things. Whereas if I was probably pitching agents when I was in my late 20s, but if I'd been in my early 20s, maybe they wouldn't have trusted that I could do that. I don't know, you know, like I had a resume, I guess. Oh yes, 5 minute self-compassion break, Martha. Yeah, I love all those. Sorry, looking at the chat.
Awesome. Okay. Well, if anybody else, we can just, you know, take up a few more questions if anybody has any. Somebody's asking if you're willing to share the name of your business coach and if you recommend them.
Oh yeah, I do this far. He works with his name's Dan Blank. He works with artists and writers. He's been great thus far. Yeah, I've just been working with him for like 2 months. but he's been great. Yeah.
Great. And it
I
sounds
guess
like
the
you're
other thing I want to add is just the importance of getting help is something that I keep learning again and again. And I know you're all here, so already you're doing that, and community. Like as soon as I started kind of hiring people to help me, or, you know, having peer critique and paid critique, like my work just got a lot better and faster. And so, you know, finding those right people to do that with is obviously also something that you have to figure out, but that's really helped me a huge amount.
I have one final question, actually. One of the things that I always struggle with a longer project is figuring out when to get feedback from people. While it can still be changed, right? Like when you're creating comics, it's like you have to do a fair amount of work so that anybody else can even read it, right?
Right.
And for me, I've never been very successful at getting feedback from like a script or something. Like people don't, you know, they're like, great. So I wasn't sure if you had a certain time where you were like, okay, now is the time to pause and like show it to someone.
I mean, I tend to get feedback on concept stuff pretty early, like and plot stuff before I have a script or art. But I think it's also people's literacy in terms of graphic novels and their ability to visualize a script. That's also why I do my scripts page like broken down into one panel, you know, one page of a graphic novel equals one page of the script, because I think giving feedback's a lot easier on that. But I don't know, I find that it's a tricky thing, and I don't know that there's an answer for each project. I think often if you're feeling like you need feedback, it's probably a good time, but I know that there are times when I feel scared to get feedback because I'm worried it'll throw me off or whatever, and then I tend to wait to do that until it feels a little more solid. But you have to have, you're right, you have to have enough stuff to show people and in a format that they can understand. So I don't know. That's not really, it's a non-answer.
No, that's helpful. It's helpful to hear that, you know, it's something that probably everybody struggles with. We have Sarah's raising their hand, and so is Jesse Brandt. Let's start with Jesse. You can unmute.
Yeah, I was just curious because you were talking about working a lot with metaphor and imagination in your work. I'm curious if maybe you already said, but so you're usually starting with visual stuff. How are you thinking through like what words you do want to use and what you want people to be saying versus like narration? And I'm just curious your process in terms of like that balance.
Yeah, for adaptation, it's really hard because I'm working from a prose book that has tons of narration and thought, you know, and I don't love thought bubbles like as a concept. I don't know, I don't like them visually. So that's why in Gatsby and in my current adaptation, I work the narration into the landscape because I feel like it doesn't weigh down the text as much. And then I'm just choosing narration that I feel like is either, you know, is beautiful, it's driving the story forward. But everything else, like basically I try to cut like like if I can convey something visually, I don't like to include it as text in the book, is basically how I kind of decide on it. I don't like super wordy graphic novels. And so I'm really trying to cut out as much text as I can. And sometimes I use text as blocks and sometimes I use it into the landscape. And then I do use thought bubbles. Some people don't, but I don't do bubbles around them. Which is like I have my methods, but it's tricky. But I guess I'm basically trying to pare it down as much as possible is kind of the answer. And then when I'm working with somebody else beautiful writing like Fitzgerald, then I'm choosing those things that I could not convey or that just add to my art and make my art make more sense. That helps. Okay, thanks, Josie.
Sarah, do you have a question?
Yeah. Going back to asking people for help, what do you do if there's like kind of a spoiler in the story that you don't want so many people to see? What do you do then? Like you want to get advice on this thing, but you don't want to have a lot of people know about it because that might ruin the surprise of the story.
I mean, if I'm asking for feedback, it's not usually to a group, you know, it's usually to individuals or a very small group. And I think for me, I want them to know the spoilers, I guess. You know, like if they're reading it, like I want them to know the spoilers in the right order, I guess. You know, that if they're reading the story, the spoiler should happen in the story when it should happen. But I wouldn't like, yeah, I wouldn't be worried about that, but I'm not so concerned about like, yeah, ruining a spoiler, I guess is never. It's also like I'm not like as a person, I don't get that bummed out if stories are spoiled for me. Like I'm reading it for a different reason. Like I want the journey. And so if I know what happens at the end, generally I can guess what's happening at the end anyway, but I still read it. So I don't know if that helps Sarah, but it's kind of how I think about it. William?
Hi, yeah, I kind of have two questions, but I'm going to pose them both at once. And this one is jumping off of what Sarah was saying. And I was just curious, specifically with writing memoir, when you're stuck and you're looking for feedback, where do you find community or who do you present it to? Are you on SAW? Do you bring it to your close friends who know you really well? Do you bring it to like those who the story pertains to? Or are you bringing it to your editor? I'm just curious about who you're turning to for feedback when the story is so close to your reality.
Yeah, I'm definitely not bringing it to the people who are in it, because they have their own view of it, and it's likely not the same as yours, and that would just derail me. And the people who are reading it have very strong emotions. They bring like there were things that they read in my book that were not at all my intention and what nobody else read, you know, but because they were bringing their own stuff to it, they thought certain things about it. So they're biased. So like I would not recommend asking those people unless you're at the point in the story where so far along that you want like, did this happen? You know, like that kind of conversation. I don't tend to ask my close friends anymore. I used to when I was earlier in my career, but they're not graphic novelists and they are, you know, they just love it, right? They're like, this is great. You know, it's not productive feedback. Like it's nice. Like I like to share things with them sometimes because I care about them and, you know, but it's not actually useful. I tend to find graphic novelists who are at a similar stage in their careers to me and ask them for feedback. So when I was unpublished, you know, it was kind of people I'd meet in classes, like at CCS, Center for Cartoon Studies. You know, I'd meet people in a class and we kind of keep meeting after that on Zoom and we'd share each other's work. And I got a lot from that for many years. And now it's more like other kind of published authors who give me feedback, or I hire somebody like Rob Cloud to help me. So, and I kind of choose people based on like, I kind of go in knowing some people have certain strengths, you know, if I'm presenting them a romance, but they are a guy who loves sci-fi, like I know that type of feedback, you know, to take that with that lens, like he might never read romance, so the feedback might be, you know, different, but so I kind of, yeah, it's hard asking for getting feedback. You want it, I want it, but I also, you know, you want it from the right people.
Mm-hmm.
Not
Yeah, that
you,
makes sense.
you.
It sounds like you're fairly selective. And my second question is, I'm curious what your big inspirations are. Like, are there any like artists or writers, authors you're looking towards right now, or role models in that sense?
I mean, right now, because I'm trying to figure out like an art business, I've been looking a lot at like Wendy McNaughton, who does Draw Together. And like Samantha Dion Baker, who does like Draw Your World, which are more kind of drawing type people who inspire others to draw. And so I've been looking at their work a lot in terms of graphic novelists. Like I love like David Small, who did Stitches. I love Emil Ferris. You know, Blankets is so wonderful. There's so many. I think Tilly Walden is always inspiring. And I'm just looking up, my books are up above me. So I'm like, so yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, William.
Awesome. Okay, I think maybe it's time to wrap it up.
Cool. Thank you all so much. This is great.
And I don't know if someone wants the names in the chat. I'm not going to be fast enough. So if anybody feels like dropping them in there, Tilly Walden, Emil Ferris, that's my favorite thing is monsters, right?
Yeah.
Blankets,
Yeah.
David Small. Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Well, this was really wonderful, Catherine. Thank you so much for sharing your process and answering all these questions. And it's really inspiring to follow you.
Oh, thanks. Thanks. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming for everyone, and I'm happy to answer any questions following up on this. So great. Thank you.
All right.
Yes.
See you in the Mighty Network.
Yep. Okay. Bye.
Thanks for joining us. This has been a production of the Sequential Artists Workshop, or SAW. You can find us on social media at Comics Workshop and online at sawcomics.org. You can hear about our many courses at learn.sawcomics.org. SAW is a nonprofit and supported by people like you. Learn how to make a tax-deductible donation at the donate page of sawcomics.org. You can join our free community of comics explorers at members.sawcomics.org. Thanks so much for being here.